Hello. Thank you for joining us today to discuss CMS high-risk areas. Please let us know that you're here by dropping your name and your organization's name into the chat box. We encourage you throughout this webinar to post questions and submit questions throughout. You can also do this by emailing healthcare@tier1performance.com. We will answer as many questions at the end of this webinar as time allows, and we will follow up after this webinar with all of the Q&A and a link to this recorded webinar and any resources and articles that we discussed today. I am Lena Browning, and I'm the studio director here at TiER1 Healthcare. And today, joining me, I have a panel of subject matter experts. Today, we have Tabitha Garbart. She is our senior nurse consultant. She will be discussing suicide and ligature risk. Next, we have Lisa Waldowski. She is our infection preventionist here at TiER1 Healthcare. She will be discussing high-level disinfection, sterilization, hemodialysis, and as it relates to equipment. And last but not least, we have Ken Blackwell. He is our life safety engineer, and he's going to be discussing risk within the environment of care. We will hear from each of them for a few minutes, and then we will open the floor for Q&A. So let's begin. Our first consultant, Tabitha Garbart, would you please like to share with us some of the risks in hospitals that are challenges revolving around suicide and ligature risk?
Absolutely, Lena. So ensuring our patients receive safe care in a safe setting continues to be a concern for organizations. So the first thing that we must remember is that the rules change depending upon the area that the patient with suicidal ideation is being cared for in. So let's look at some of those areas. The first area that we like to look at is our inpatient behavioral health unit, or a designated behavioral health unit in the ED. Both of them have to follow the same rules. So the rules are that they must be ligature resistant in the following areas. So remember, ligature resistant in bathrooms, patient rooms, the transition zone between the patient room and the bathroom, the doors between the patient rooms and hallways, and any area that is not visible in the corridor at the nurse's station. Also make sure you're looking at your common patient areas. So we must maintain a ligature resistant environment in those particular spaces. The emergency room, though, we have two different paths that we can choose. So option number one is going to be to place the patient in a ligature resistant environment. Option number two is going to be initiate that one-to-one monitoring. When we do that, we have to have continuous visual observation and remove all objects that pose a risk for the patient unless they are needed to provide that direct patient care. The other area that we must look at is our general inpatient units. Our only option for those units is to initiate that one-to-one, remembering that we want to take everything that we possibly can out of the patient's room that's not deemed medically necessary. There are some other strategies for its success and some essential components that we need to look at when we're talking about maintaining this ligature-resistant environment. So the first thing we need to do is identify patients who are at risk. So this involves getting a suicidal early identification screening tool. So we need to use an evidence-based tool to screen patients who are at risk for harming themselves or harming others. If that patient screens positive for suicidal ideation, then we have to do the next step, which is an evidence-based assessment tool, and that allows us to place the patients at the appropriate level of risk. So the next essential component is to identify ligature points in the environment and those mitigation strategies. So that is all about performing the environmental risk assessment. So this has to be a multidisciplinary approach to looking at areas in each unit and identifying the ligature points and the appropriate mitigation strategies. So where we see organizations struggle the most is, for instance, in the ED. We must look at the patient exam rooms, the patient bathrooms, and any other area that the patient might visit. So this might include doing an environmental risk assessment in triage. So examples of looking at that mitigation strategy after you identify the ligature point is that you have to look at what the mitigation strategy is. So for instance, do we need to remove the items from the room because they're not medically necessary? Do we need to provide that one-to-one observation? And do we need to secure those personal belongings? So identifying every mitigation strategy is very important when conducting your environmental risk assessment. So the last and final piece is looking at the competency and training that we are providing to our staff. So we have to look at what our policy is guiding us in, how it's teaching us to do our assessments, our reassessments, our toileting practices, and all other areas. So we really want that competency and that policy to drive the staff towards that. So remember that in a survey, staff are going to be asked about the training that they've received, and they're going to be asked about all of the great practices that you've implemented at your organization. So be prepared to breathe and brag. Be prepared to show those competencies because they will be reviewed in the HR session. All right, Lena, thank you.
Thank you, Tabitha. And if you want to learn more about suicide and ligature risk, we will be including other articles that Tabitha has published within the follow-up email out to our registered attendees. Next, we have Ms. Lisa Wadowski to talk about infection prevention. Lisa, would you like to share some of the highlights?
Thank you, Lena. The conditions of participation from CMS that my discussion points will be pertaining to have to do with infection control, condition of participation, and surgical services. When you look at the highest risk topics that seem to continue through CMS's lenses pose a high risk, have to do with infection control specific to high-level disinfection and sterilization. When we look at high-level disinfection, and this can incorporate commonly endoscopes, probes, and some high-risk equipment that we may not have on our radar, organizations need to step back and look at their infection prevention and control risk assessment and infection control plan to help get a better understanding, first and foremost, where all of the locations in our organization that may have merged or acquired other entities, specifically ambulatory or offsite locations that may be performing high-level disinfection and or sterilization. And these are commonly high-risk locations because we don't often get out there to visit and see what they're actually performing in those environments. When we're looking at equipment and devices for high-level disinfection, oftentimes we don't have a clear inventory of where all of these devices are housed or stored. So first and foremost, looking at that inventory and having a master list that will continue to be updated because devices go out of commission and we add new devices along the way. We need to have the manufacturer's instructions for use for these devices. Oftentimes organizations are challenged with not knowing that a piece of equipment may, for example, a temperature probe on a high-risk piece of equipment like a ventilator requires high-level disinfection and or sterilization. So we continue to work with organizations and uncover pieces of equipment that we did not read the manufacturer's instructions for use and therefore aren't following the cleaning, disinfection, and or sterilization practices. Another troubling device is surface probes that we are encountering that encompass and touch non-intact skin based on intended use that are not being high-level disinfected. So we would definitely want to assure that organizations are reviewing devices and pieces of equipment instructions for use. They have selected evidence-based guidelines to drive their practices, specifically to sterilization, specifically to high-level disinfection of endoscopes, and then high-level disinfection of other items such as probes. We have to, first and foremost, when we're having these discussions with our risk assessment for these processes that we would intend and support in a standardized manner, always consider, if applicable, a disposable option to minimize risk. with the multifaceted issues that come up with high-level disinfection process steps and or sterilization steps. This includes competency training, education, oversight. Again, staff come and go. We want to monitor these processes to assure no one is taking shortcuts or omitting steps along the way. We have high-risk equipment that we repeatedly see as mentioned, temperature probes, surface probes, eye devices, that when we are pulling the instructions for use, and whether they're dated instructions for use or we have the most recent instructions for use, organizations now best practice is to put them on an automated central means for all staff to have access to this. And obviously you can also have manual binders, but again, caution with keeping those updated. When we look at sterilization, we're still encountering challenges with pre-cleaning at point of use and finding instrumentation along the way from pre-cleaning where the procedure is performed to decontamination, that we have challenges with keeping those instruments dry. They are dry and we're not keeping them moist, or based on instructions for use for products that have been purchased and used, that we're not keeping instrumentation as recommended by the manufacturer's instructions for use in the open position. Hemodialysis also poses its challenges. First and foremost, knowing if you have a contracted service or it's internal to your organization is very important to know. And we also see and encounter cleaning challenges, whether it be environmentally or with the dialysis machine itself. So following what the dialysis machine instructions for use on recommendations for cleaning and or disinfectants, choosing the right level of a bleach concentration if recommended, knowing 1 to 10 versus 1 to 100 concentrations are very critical, cleaning our environment before we clean the dialysis machine so we don't recontaminate the piece of equipment, wearing appropriate personal protective equipment as instructed by the recommendations of a manufacturer's instructions for use for the products that we are using along the way. So again, you will hear, as you just heard in a short presentation by myself, that we have the same mantra going on for high-level disinfection, sterilization, and dialysis. And those takeaway points are following manufacturer's instructions for use and actually acquiring the manufacturer's instructions for use, reading those or going over those with your infection preventionist to assure that there's clear understanding of cleaning and disinfection or sterilization recommendations for the pieces of equipment and devices. Ongoing monitoring of these process steps to assure there are no omissions or shortcuts being taken for these very critical process steps. Competency training, education, first and foremost, initially on an ongoing basis, are all critical to assure that our process steps are being taken with the supportive documentation that needs to be evidence-based, that you will have selected along the way for HLD and sterilization purposes. Thank you, Lena, back to you.
And if you're interested in learning more about other articles that Lisa has published, we will also be including those in our follow-up response with the links attached. Next, we will go to Ken Blackwell, our life safety engineer, to discuss some of the risk within the environment of care. Here's to you, Ken.
Good morning, Lena, and thank you. So let's talk a little bit about the kitchen. There has been a huge emphasis by Joint Commission and CMS on the kitchen over the past year. As a matter of fact, the kitchen is no longer a 10-minute walkthrough for life safety code surveyors in particular. Last year, the Joint Commission issued or required training for clinicians and the life safety code surveyors. They even distributed a checklist, and that checklist came from the IC standards, the PC standards. It came from LS, of course, and the environment of care. This may be a little extreme, but I talked to an organization that actually went through a early survey the first part of the year, the first quarter of the year. And they actually talked about the fact that it took much longer from the life safety code engineer. And what really was interesting to me was that they said the engineer actually got down on his knees and actually positioned himself on his chest. This is no joke. That he positioned himself on his chest just to look under an appliance. So, like I said, it is a huge emphasis now from the Joint Commission and from CMS. So let me give you some tips on how to have a successful outcome during your next survey. So the first thing I think you want to do, if you don't have a member of the dietary staff on your environmental care committee, then definitely invite someone, have them sit on that committee. And then the next thing you want to do is form a team made up of an IC professional, obviously facilities, and someone from the kitchen. And begin to schedule different inspections of the kitchen, and don't make them just 30 minutes. Put some time in it, because it's going to take some time to go through the kitchen. And I would suggest to do it when staff is working and when staff is not working. The other tips here are just some more of a life technical issue there. So here are some other tips. All right, so make sure that you maintain 16 inches between the deep fryer and the surface flames of the adjacent equipment. Now, if you cannot and you don't have 16 inches to spare to put between the two appliances, then you can always mount a metal splash guard or even a glass splash guard for that matter. Don't forget about the 18-inch rule. I see that a lot in kitchens. So the 18-inch rule as it relates to sprinkler heads, make sure the refrigerator and or the freezers, you have that 18-inch clearance. And then make sure you secure your O2 or your CO cylinders. I see those sometimes not chained. Then check the condition of the ceiling tiles and the ceiling tile grids. What I'm finding is a lot of rust, and I'm also finding paint chips where people have tried to recondition the ceiling tile grid, believe it or not. Also, make sure that the grease, there is not a buildup of grease on the kitchen hoods. And that gas shutoff valve, make sure it's labeled. I see it a lot. A lot of times walking through the kitchen and you ask where is the gas shutoff. Some people know it and some people don't. So therefore you need to definitely label those. And then that K extinguisher, just remember that K extinguisher needs to be mounted within 30 feet of your deep fryer or any grease producing appliance that is in your kitchen. Lena, that's it, and I'm going to give it back to you.
Ken. And Ken has many published articles. We will also include those in our follow-up email out to all attendees today. We are going to open the floor now for questions and answers that have came through. Thank you for your responses and keep them coming. Ken, it looks like the first question is going to come to you. And the question is, can we only have 12 e-cylinders outside of storage in a smoke compartment? And does partial or empty cylinders add to the equation?
Wow, Lena, that's a great question. So let's look at that. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into that particular question because that seems to be an ongoing issue for years. So the rule of thumb here is this. So you can have 12 e-cylinders stored anywhere in your smoke compartment outside of a storage area. All right. So 12 is the key. Now, sometimes I walk through facilities and I will see or a smoke compartment and I'll see an H cylinder, and that's your larger cylinder. So one thing about the H cylinder actually is equivalent to an E cylinder, believe it or not. So you can only have one H cylinder stored outside of a storage unit, or again, 12 E cylinders. Believe it or not, I had an organization to actually ask a question, and they asked me, could they actually store their e-cylinders in the mounted rack on their wheelchairs? And that got me a little bit nervous because I don't think that they actually considered the fact that when you actually have those e-cylinders in those wheelchairs, and you are referring to those as storage because I think they wanted quick access, then that counts against that total number that I just mentioned of those 12 e-cylinders. And believe it or not, the empties also count, empties and partials count in that total aggregate. So keep in mind when it comes to these e-cylinders, you got to count the empties and the partial cylinders. And now back to you, Lena.
Our next question will be for Tabitha. And they ask, how often should the environmental risk assessment be conducted?
Okay, great question again. So the environmental risk assessment needs to be a document that is at least reviewed annually or when there's changes that occur. So for an example, if there's construction in an area, we need to relook at that area to make sure that we do not have any additional ligature points that needed to be added to that environmental risk assessment. So remember that this is a multidisciplinary approach with a team, that this should be presented to leadership, that the leadership should present this to the governing body committee, and then this should be a part of the hospital's QAPI program, that Quality Assurance Performance Improvement Program, to make sure that everything is getting included in that. Thanks, Lena.
Thank you, Tabitha. Our next question will be to Lisa Wadowski. What are the most common challenges hospitals face with medical equipment and devices as it pertains to high-level disinfection, sterilization, and hemodialysis?
Great question. Thanks, Lena. So organizations, again, first and foremost, need to, based on risk assessment, know where their locations are that have devices and equipment that require high-level disinfection, sterilization, and obviously the location inpatient and outpatient, if applicable, for hemodialysis. So centralized versus decentralized locations, I think organizations continue to struggle with knowing whether or not to have everything go down to central sterile processing or have key locations that do these processes frequently, that keep their skills and competency training and education up to support processes that are not broken. And then looking at options that are disposable. I think that should always be on the radar because over time, disposable options have become more frequently available, and the products that are disposable, their caliber has improved over time. So again, knowing your inventory and location, centralized versus decentralized locations, monitoring these processes with competency training and education, and then again, always looking at disposable options. Thank you, Lena. Back to you.
Thank you, Lisa. Our next question will be for Ken. Does the Life Safety Code allow cameras, speakers, or card readers to be installed within the stairwell?
Wow, Lena, that's another great question. I see this on survey quite a bit. And I think what happens is that organizations will mount speakers and they will mount cameras inside of the exit enclosures or your stairwells. And most of them, I understand why they do it. They do it for security purposes, right? And the Life Safety Code actually is kind of silent on mounting cameras and speakers and other things inside the stairwell. However, it does talk about what you can store or what you can mount in there. So it does talk about the fact that you can have door assemblies permitted. You can also have electrical conduits, okay? And those conduits that serve that exit enclosure. It also talks about water and steam piping necessary for heating or cooling that exit enclosure. And it also talks about sprinkler piping and standpipes. So those are, and one more thing that they do allow is fire alarm circuits. So those are the only things that so far right now that the Life Safety Code will allow one to actually be mounted within that stairwell. And the issue is penetrations, obviously. Thanks, Lena. Back to you.
Thank you, Ken. Our next question will be for Tabitha. When is it appropriate to use video monitoring for suicide and risk?
Oh, wow. So that question comes up quite a bit during survey. And so the one thing I can tell you is that it's never appropriate to use video monitoring in lieu of placing a patient on a one-to-one observation when they are at high risk for suicide. Video monitoring is really that backup tool. It is a tool that you use, and it's a tool that you consider using too if you have a violent or aggressive patient and you don't think it's safe for a staff member to be in the room with that patient. And that's when video monitoring becomes appropriate.
Thank you, Tabitha. Our next question will be for Lisa. How can organizations mitigate the risk of transmitting infections from medical equipment and devices specific to high-level disinfection, sterilization, and hemodialysis?
Thank you, Lena. Similar to the former question asked, I can't stress enough that to mitigate risk with high-level disinfection and sterilization, you need to know where these pieces of equipment and devices are physically located. And then following the instructions for use and your selected evidence-based guidelines to assure that you have selected the appropriate cleaning products, disinfection and/or sterilization, and we are not under cleaning or under high level, inappropriately not selecting the right level of high level disinfection or sterilization, posing a risk that you would be using a piece of equipment or a device on a patient that wasn't properly cleaned or disinfected. So competency training and education, ongoing awareness and adhering to instructions for use and selected evidence-based guidelines with oversight of these processes is a complete package to assure that we are not putting dirty equipment or pieces of our devices on patients on a routine basis. Thank you, Lena. Back to you.
Thank you, Lisa. And the next question is also for Lisa. And the question is, what are some resources that organizations may use to address high-level disinfection, sterilization, and hemodialysis?
Great question. Thanks, Lena. So in addition to what Lena has shown you on our website on some resources on these topics that are included in the articles, obviously for infection prevention and control, there are APIC, the Association for Professionals in Infection Prevention and Control, the selected evidence-based guidelines of which you want to be using or assure you're using the most recent publication. That could come from AAMI standards, that could come from AORN standards, CDC standards, particularly for hemodialysis questions and concerns, to assure you're using the most recent information is very key. There are also in Joint Commission resources some excellent combined infection control and APIC workbooks that they will be coming out with a new one this coming year, but the third edition is still very usable and up to date as things currently stand. Back to you, Lena.
Okay, Lisa. And we here at TiER1 Healthcare, thank you very much for attending this webinar today. As a reminder, we will send out all questions submitted with answers and resources and links to this recording and to the articles that we discussed today. Thank you.